Welcome to Season 3 of Students of Mind, the podcast that's all about opening up and normalizing discussions about mental health in ways that anyone can comprehend. In the first 2 seasons, we sat down with mental health experts and survivors to give you a full circle picture of each topic. In this new season, we will continue to explore the world of mental health through the insights of experts, healers, and individuals with lived experience. From alternative healing modalities to living with multiple illnesses, this season we will cover a wide range of topics with the help of a diverse selection of guests. My name is Jayde, and for today's episode, we're continuing the conversation on psychedelic healing with guests Jonathan de Potter and Julia Blum. I hope by listening to the show, you're able to learn something new and gain some encouragement through hearing our experts and listening to the journeys of our guests. However, this show is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your mental health professional or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have about your condition. Never disregard professional advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on the Students of Mind podcast. Today's first guest is Jonathan de Potter. Jonathan is the founder and CEO of Behold Retreats. Behold Retreats is a company that facilitates plant medicine journeys through a research-backed, expert-guided, multi-week experience. After years of working in management consulting in the corporate world, Jonathan now devotes his time to Behold Retreats and spreading education and awareness of the transformative and healing nature of plant medicine. Welcome, Jonathan. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jayde. It's lovely to be here and very much looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, I am looking forward to it too. But before we get into the juice of the conversation today, can you talk a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Hawaii, pretty, I would say, lucky to have loving parents and quite spiritual parents as well. And despite that, I had some kind of suppressed childhood trauma that I didn't know about for most of my life. And I was an atheist myself. I didn't have really a spiritual connection personally. And so the work that I do now, in contrast to many years in strategy and management consulting in the corporate world, is to facilitate plant medicine retreats, psychedelic plant medicine retreats. And I do so naturally through my own journey. This has been such a powerful tool for me to discover more of myself and to help me release some of that childhood trauma and just to get to know myself better and to become a student of my own mind.
Great. That goes right into our first question, which is, how did you get into this work with plant medicine? I know you said that you've had your own experiences, so I'm interested to hear what prompted you to start this type of work.
For me, what I often say is that it was my own journey, my own path, my own discovery of plant medicine, and also some of the shortcomings of what I experienced through the various retreats that I had attended. that led me to understand and believe that I could be of greater service to my friends, to my professional network, those who were, feeling the call to explore this territory, to avoid some of the potholes that I had, shall we say, rolled through over those experiences and over those retreats. Psychedelics, plant medicine, it's such a powerful tool when it's appropriately used with, the right intentionality, the right preparation, the right facilitators, the right healers during such a powerful experience. And then, of course, most importantly, guided integration following such an experience, so that we can really anchor our lessons back here back in the real world. And so, through these experiences, I became increasingly motivated to guide others. And so it started by facilitating my own friends on retreat and inviting them on retreats, and then it just kind of naturally evolved into Behold Retreats and the business that it is today.
Yeah, so can you talk more about Behold Retreats and kind of like the mission behind Behold Retreats, and then the types of plant medicines that you guys actually work with?
Yeah, sure. So what I came to recognize over time is, on a fundamental level, it's not a psychedelic experience or even a psychedelic retreat that we're looking for. What we're trying to achieve through this work is to raise our vibration, and to do so in a way that we keep an elevated vibration. Now, achieving that with psychedelics takes a lot more than just the experiences themselves. So the mental and emotional work, as I mentioned before, preparation and integration before and after, all of these elements kind of need to come together in order to be able to get the most out of the experience, and then to maintain an elevated state. What often happens with these experiences is that, someone flies down to Costa Rica or to Mexico, they have a really life-affirming, life-changing retreat, and then 2 or 3 weeks later they're back at home. Schedule's the same, job is the same, relationships are the same. You're still perhaps going out drinking with your buddies on a Friday night. All of a sudden they realize, oh my God, I feel exactly the way it was before. All that clarity, that kind of higher vibrational feeling, that joy for life that I felt at the end of the retreat and maybe the week or two that followed is gone. And so I think it's quite common for people to begin to identify with that state of being that they had post retreat, and think that perhaps they need another retreat. And it's not the case. What they actually need is to make the everyday lifestyle changes that are going to allow them to live in this more elevated state on a more permanent basis. So that's that's the meditation, that's the walk with the dog in the morning, that's all of the breath work, perhaps yoga, making healthy food choices. These are all of the sorts of things that people need to be bringing back with them into the real world. And so a lot of what we do with Behold Retreats is really bringing together that broader set of components, such that people get a more significant and sustainable shift without so many plant medicine retreats. So more progress with less medicine.
I want to get into the whole process of preparation, the actual experience, and then integration. But before we do that, can you talk about which plant medicines that you guys use? And also before that, just for clarity for the listeners, in case that they're not used to this topic, I've seen on your website, and also just as we're talking, I hear you use psychedelics and plant medicine, both of those terms. So can we kind of give a definition of that, so if listeners are a bit confused, they can understand?
Yeah, I think it's a good point of clarification to make. There is, I would say, a bit of interchangeable use, and also a lot of broadening of labels in this space that's taking place at many levels, and different people have their own definitions and their own expectations of these words, so it's a bit loaded, to be perfectly honest. But in general terms, when people use the term psychedelics, they are referring to the category of either plant medicine or synthetic medicines that are neurogenerative, so they facilitate the growth of new neurons, that facilitate neuroplasticity, so a greater interconnectivity between regions of the brain, some of which may not be as used to exchanging information as we might like. And then I would say that they also facilitate greater access to our subconscious, right? So there's the things that we have in our everyday waking consciousness, and there's the things that sit below that in the subconscious. And so through amplifying our sensitivity, we are able to surface, process, and release some of those lower level emotions, the lower level traumas that are being stored in our physical and or energetic body, so that we are raising our vibration. And over time, we kind of recognize that what we're trying to do with this work is to heal our minds, improve positivity of our thinking. We're trying to open our hearts, and then we're trying to harmonize mind, body, heart, and spirit to that higher vibration. So that's kind of a bit of a definition for psychedelics. Then you have plant medicine, which obviously is a much broader category, but often people who are working with psychedelics will use the term plant medicine to refer to plant-based psychedelics. Now, unhelpfully, they are also typically referring to non-plant plant medicines when they do so. So I'm going to use the examples of the medicines that we work with. So we predominantly work with psilocybin, which is magic mushroom, ayahuasca, which is the combination of two plants with the underlying active molecule, which is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And then we also work with what is often known as bufo, or 5-MeO DMT. So the mushroom is a fungi. Ayahuasca is a plant medicine, strictly speaking, and then 5-MeO DMT can either come from a plant source, actually an animal source, the Sonoran desert toad, or it can also come in synthetic format. And often, myself, for example, I will use the term plant medicine to refer to psilocybin, the mushroom, fungi, the ayahuasca, and also 5-MeO DMT, which, again, strictly speaking, isn't accurate, but it's a simplification of terms in order to be able to communicate efficiently.
Great. That is so helpful. Even for me, I think that was a great way to clarify everything. And so speaking to that, can we start talking about each step of the retreat process? So the preparation, the actual experience, and the integration. What does that look like?
Yeah, the place I often like to start is by observing that psychedelics in of themselves aren't necessarily the answer. Plant medicine isn't necessarily the answer. I think we all probably know people who speak very highly of plant medicine, but they're still full of scarcity, negativity, judgment, maybe bad relationships, messy house, all of these things that we're definitely not aiming for. And so what's important is intentionality, preparation, quality facilitation, quality guidance, and integration. So I'll talk you through that process. So I think first and foremost, it's helpful for people to get clear on who they are going to be. Each and every one of us is perfect as we are in the present. I truly believe that. The paradox is that we can also be better. And so it invites us into accepting ourselves as we are in this moment, rather than saying, "Oh, I need more healing. I need to be in this other place where I'm going to have the job of my dreams and the relationship of my dreams, and everything's going to be better." That if we're living in that state of being, that's never ending, because there's always improvements to be had. And so we'll get to the end of our lives and go, oh man, I've just lived for 90 long years wishing that things were different than they are. And that's just, not a very nice way to live life. So that being said, number one, who is your future self? And getting descriptive about who that person is, and getting excited about bringing that person from your imagination and out into the real world. That's kind of step one. Step two is okay. So why isn't that person here today? What are the mental and emotional blocks in your mind that are perhaps past traumas that are keeping that version of yourself from flourishing out here in the real world? And this is where really coaching and therapy comes into its own, because the mind is just, as the mind is just an incredibly powerful but also tricky customer. It just has so many deviations through which it can convince itself that it's small, or that we're small, and we're not. Each of us is limitless. Each of us is a perfect divine expression of spirit with unique gifts to bring out into the world and to share with the world. And with that, we will find our success. We will find our abundance. All of those things that all of us want, and can be fundamental to the human experience, if we allow it. So stepping through that process is important. And then third is really some tools and some practices for working with medicine and ceremony. So I'm going to give two examples. So for me, my first retreat was very challenging. I kept passing out, and if I had some tools, and this is going to sound really silly, but if someone had told me to breathe when I was having challenging times, I would have had, I think, a very different experience. So I was actually forgetting to breathe. The experience itself was so powerful that it was kind of pulling me out of the 3D. And so the breath is a very powerful way to stay connected and stay grounded between this world, the spirit world, and the 3D world. So these sorts of tools to begin to help people see their minds, to prepare for ceremony, and also to continue to elevate their consciousness post-retreat, so that it's not just experiential in its nature. So that's a lot about what we do pre-retreat. With ayahuasca in particular, there's also more in terms of dietary requirements. So people have to clean up their diet. I always recommend to people that they think about a retreat of this nature on energetic terms. So every decision that we make in preparation for such an experience is going to be reciprocated. So if we've got a clean diet, we're taking care of ourselves, we're being as loving as possible, we're reviewing our intentions 3 or 4 times a day in the time leading up to the retreat, that's going to make a big impact. And so when we do all of these preparatory steps ahead of stepping into the work with the medicine, then the medicine, or spirit, as we may describe it, can reciprocate, because there's a clear intentionality, there's a clear request. And so one of the ways that I like to describe this is that, okay, you're here, but you want to be in this other place. And so in these ceremonies, you will often be shown the things that you need to be willing to let go of, or the things that you need to be willing to embody in order to begin to make those steps towards that future self. And so that's, when that's done correctly and people are able to step into that in a prepared and grounded sense, then that's amazing. People get a lot out of the retreat. Now, coming out of such an experience, some people can feel like, let me say, the very fabric of reality has kind of been pulled out from under them when they're on retreat. If they've had a powerful breakthrough, a powerful experience, then we can often lose what I would describe as our psychic anchors. The way that we see reality itself has changed to a large degree, and so that's why it's important to be guided in the integration process. If I take my own example, perhaps the first time I discovered my childhood trauma, my inclination might be to immediately reach out to my parents and to describe to them some of the childhood trauma that I've been through. Now, maybe, right? But a coach or a therapist can really help you integrate that experience into your own being in the first instance. And then from that place of being made whole at the level of the individual, then you can begin to think about your next steps. Also, we have guests, we have clients that, they come on one retreat and they're like, I'm selling my business, I'm moving the family, we're going to buy a house in Costa Rica, start a new life. And you're like, that's amazing. I'm so happy for you. You're making big steps in your life. Maybe you'd like to speak to a coach for a couple of weeks before you start to make these, huge life-changing decisions. Not to say it's not the right thing. You've clearly got yourself a very powerful message, but slowly, softly is generally the right approach.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how holistic it sounds. I think just using my experience, the way the program that I'm a part of for ketamine is very clinical, and it's been great, but I think part of what I'm missing is that like guided experience of having some help with integration afterwards and preparation beforehand, because that's kind of what I'm doing on my own now. So it's so great to hear that you guys have this whole process before and after to support your clients with. I think that's a really positive thing. I want to talk about the retreat experience itself. What do you think the benefits of healing in that type of space are?
Yeah. So I see a number of benefits to taking a week for an experience of this nature. I think number one, just stepping out of our everyday context and meeting a new group of people at a beautiful location. That in of itself has tremendous value. I think particularly in the US, there's a habit of trying to do things quickly. And at a deep level, this work is about slowing down and doing the things that are aligned to who and what we are as individuals. And so when people are like, "Oh yeah, I'm going for a 2-day retreat. I'm going to drive down 3 hours and do 2 ceremonies in 2 nights and then drive back," it's like, wow, that's intense. That's not, it's not the way that I would wish to do the work myself, nor would I wish that for friends and people that I care for. But some people have limitations around time and indeed budget and in their ability to take a week for themselves. So I think just taking a week for yourself is a beautiful and important thing for those who are in a position to do so. I think the second thing is the number of layers that we are able to peel away over the duration of a week. So, if we do say 3 or 4 ceremonies over the course of a week, then we're just able to peel away more of our layers of what we are not, and that's a lot of what we're trying to do with this work. So, if we were to go do one ceremony, an hour and a half away, and then come back home for a week and then go do another an hour and a half away, then what tends to happen is all of the things that are around us that we're not come rushing back between those experiences. And so when we break through a few of those layers, then often there's a greater, I would say, stickiness to the change that is facilitated in that way. The other thing that I would mention would be the healers, the quality of the healers, right? A lot of this work happens underground, obviously, because it's not legal. But that being said, the quality healers, the people who do this work really well and have dedicated their lives to this work, they often choose to live in locations where this work is permitted, so that they don't have to be constantly looking over their shoulder going, "Oh man, is today going to be the day that someone's sitting outside trying to catch me helping people?" And so a lot of the healers want to be open and transparent about the nature of the work that they're doing. So, For a retreat, we generally have a lot of integrative practices. So whether that's yoga, breath work, embodiment practices, there's always, healthy vegan meals, plenty of time for rest and reflection, journaling, all of those sorts of good things. So it's really, as much as anything, creating space and learning opportunities around the plant medicine experiences to go deep with ourselves. And then over time, we also plan to introduce more. At the moment, I think people are still mostly in a mode of healing, right? They've got shame, guilt, fear, grief, apathy, anger, envy, all these kind of lower level emotions stuck in their being. And so they need to kind of clear that out. As more and more people clear that out, then I see there's also a meaningful and exciting opportunity to just do more expansive retreats and integrate hiking more and integrate more cultural aspects, because there's beautiful medicines and beautiful medicines traditions from many places around the world. So we will be launching more experiences of broader nature as more people kind of clear out some of the backlog, if I may describe it as such.
Yeah, that sounds really great. I was wondering about like how you chose the healers that work on staff, and like if yeah, like how you found them, if you went like to these places like Costa Rica and everything and found them there, or how what was that process like?
Yeah, so there's a rational and a spiritual answer to this question. So
Mm.
the rational answer is you're looking for people who've done a lot of this work. There's just no replacement for decades of experience. People who have seen it all, done it all. These can be intensive experiences, and so I will be transparent in saying that I would say that I nearly died on my first retreat. Not like an ego death, just like a normal house variety death. And so, I'm grateful that I was very well looked after on the physical level. I wasn't very well looked after on the spiritual level, but that's a deeper conversation, perhaps. But people can go through very extensive challenges during these experiences. These are very powerful medicines. And so having people who have that breadth and depth of experience is super important. There's no replacement for that. So we do a lot, obviously, for any facilitators or healers that we're considering kind of working with. We really take the time and the energy to understand the philosophy of their work, the history of their work, how much of this work that they've done. Of course, we would always sit in ceremony with them if we haven't done so already. Usually that's the way in which we've kind of been introduced. We would start with something of that nature, of course, before partnering. And then from a spiritual perspective, sorry, I skipped over safety. Their understanding of safety protocols, all of those sorts of things. I will actually share with you that we had for the first time a guest arrive on one of our retreats that actually wasn't ready to do this work. So they had passed the first 3 levels of screening, which are conversational, a psychiatric, psychological and medical screening. They had also passed, and then they had also passed the consultation with the psychiatrist. But when they arrived on retreat, one of the facilitators could quite quickly see that this person was not ready for an experience of this nature, and so they had actually, shall we say, I'm not going to say fabricated. They had been selective in their responses, and they were I would say they were desperate for a retreat, for an experience of this nature, and being selective with the truth in order to try to make their way into this experience. But once they arrived on retreat, it was like, look, you're really not in a place to be able to do this, and so we had to excuse them from the retreat. Again, that's the first time that's ever happened. It does happen. We're grateful that we caught it, before the medicine work began, as opposed to after. And so again, you're looking for people who can just see this. It's in the eyes, and in the behavior. If a person is erratic and you can see that they're kind of discombobulated and confused, they're not ready for this work. So the second aspect is spiritual in nature. So the way that I often describe this is that everyone has a vibration, kind of as we spoke about before. And what we're looking for in healers is people who are at a high vibration. And so they are, one of the reasons that people seek out spiritual teachers is for this reason. It's not necessarily that they have all of the answers for you. They will perhaps be able to guide you towards finding more of your own answers within you. But there is something that's happening on an energetic level, which is that if I went and sat with one of our very high vibration healers for a week and we didn't even speak, we didn't do any medicine work, we just sat next to one another, my vibration would start to go up quite quickly, because there's a sort of harmonization of frequencies. In physics, when you have two frequencies, a high frequency and a low frequency, the lower frequency begins to harmonize up to the higher frequency. And so there's a sort of one of the descriptions you hear is the benediction of the guru, and so there's a sort of energetic exchange that's taking place, and so again, that's part of the reason why we seek out these experiences, why we want to work with quality healers, and so that kind of energetic calibration is a fundamental part of how we select our healers.
That's really cool. I love talking about like energies and vibrations. It's so interesting. So my last question about the retreats is there like a person that you would say these retreats are for? Like who are these retreats meant for?
It's interesting. People come into these experiences with such a vast variety of motivations. Some people come for, healing motivation. So it could be depression, could be anxiety, could be, a lot of people use this to help with their addictions. We don't work with addiction clients ourselves. It's more intensive work that's required relative to what we do. A lot of people also are in what I would describe as a victim mentality. So what that means is that when people are in a mode of pointing to the outside for their problems, I truly believe that we create 100% of our reality through our inner world. And for a lot of people, that's a difficult pill to swallow or even to consider. And it's not something that I used to believe. I used to believe my parents and my boss and my colleagues and my relationship, all of these things on the outside had an effect upon my world, and it's simply fundamentally not the case. It's that I'm creating my own reality, and those things are harmonizing around me, or they're not harmonizing around me, depending upon who and what I am and the energy that I'm bringing forth into the world each day. And so helping people come into this renewed understanding of being able to create their own reality is certainly a lot of clients that we work with. Not everyone is willing to entertain this possibility. So for people who want to continuously or continue to give all of the power to the outside, we don't take them as clients. Again, they can be helped through this work, but they require something more intensive than we can provide. And so for those of your audience who are listening and considering experiences of this variety, I would really encourage them to spend the time and the energy to connect with a variety of providers to really make sure that, number one, they're taking the time and energy to understand you, right? Because each of us is different, and each of us is facilitating different medicines in different ways, in different places for different types of people. And so just making sure that it's not like just one of those, I'm just going to say, retreat centers that it's like, just, hit book now on our website and come on down. If that's the energy, then, be cautious of that, because it just means there's probably going to be quite a broad variety of people on retreat. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but people could be, I'm going to say, all over the show. So we, for our guests, we do a 1-hour conversational screening as a starting point, just to, begin the energetic calibration process. And then at the end of that 1-hour call, if there's a felt energetic alignment, then we extend them an invitation to join one of our retreats. But it's not like, oh yeah, that they can just book now on our website. It's a more calibrated process. So I think that's an important aspect of people finding the right experiences for themselves.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. That's a great tip, because I think safety is another thing that is so important around psychedelic experiences or using plant medicine. And I've noticed that through everything you've said, safety has been just the consistent thread through it. So yeah, it just sounds like you really value keeping your clients safe, which is great.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because it only takes one person to have a bad experience to really shake you to your core. And so it's also a bit unfortunate, like as I described before, you have people who are very desperate to heal, and they're trying to find their ways into these experiences, and to have to say no is hard, because they want this so badly. But it's from this sounds a little bit cold, but from a business risk perspective, there's just such a high reputational challenge that comes with facilitating this work. Now, I know there's a lot of organizations that are even much more conservative than we are. And so what they do is they actually, in the clinical trials, if you're familiar a little bit, Jayde, what they typically do is they accept people into these programs that fit the minimum definition of anxiety, or they fit the minimum definition of depression. So they're not super depressed. They're not like way down there on the suicidal. They're not super anxious, but they are diagnosed with anxiety. They are. And so what they're trying to do is they're moving them out of the minimum definition and into a better place. So just with a little move to one direction, then they're saying, oh, this person is no longer clinically depressed. This person is no longer clinically anxious. Now, going a little bit deeper into that, the Western world doesn't really understand the energetic and the spiritual aspects of this work. So they're feeding the trial participants the medicines, but they're not necessarily able to, like a shaman or a healer would be able to help them navigate some of the energetic dimensions, the new energetic dimensions that become available through this work. And so there's a lot there in terms of bringing people into deeper containers with healers that can predictably help a much broader set of people than is being allowed into these clinical trials. But the understanding of this is still so fragmented. The people who do this work regularly, and the spiritual healers, etc., they're all about expanding consciousness and bringing people into very high states of being and seeing the light and the universal love and interconnectivity of all things, all these amazing, incredible, beautiful, mystical experiences. And then here in the Western world, we have all these doctors in white lab coats saying, this can help you cure and address anxiety and depression, and that's true, and we want everyone to heal, but that's really putting a limitation on the way in which we look at these medicines, and also they're not having as great a result as some of the scientific papers might lead us to believe, and that's because they're overlooking the spiritual component. They're not spiritual people, they're doctors, which is not to say that they're not spiritual. It's just that they're not healers, they're not shamans, they're not people of that nature.
Yeah, so interesting, and I just feel like there's still a lot of work to do in terms of like research around psychedelics. It feels like there's a lot of work to do, but hearing practices like yours makes me hopeful that we're going in the right direction. We're about to wrap up. I have one question that I'm asking everyone this season on the show, because I really want to put an emphasis on self-care this season because it's so important. So last question before we wrap up, what is one thing you do to maintain your mental wellness?
Meditation. Yeah, it's, for me, it's
Great.
such a powerful practice. There's from the National Science Foundation, they did some research that showed your typical person has between 12,000 and 60,000 thoughts per day. Virtually 100% of those thoughts are egoic thoughts. So that's I, me, my. 95% of those thoughts are repetitive, and 85% of those thoughts are negative. So we're thinking all the time only about ourselves, the same things, and mostly bad things. And so through taking up meditation, you can begin to see the tricks that the mind is playing and begin to make some of the necessary corrections, or some of the not necessary, but to recognize some of the opportunities that exist.
That's such an interesting way to describe meditation. I really like that. I think that could be really helpful for people. Before we end, what are some ways that my audience and I can stay up with you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, check us out at behold-retreats.com, or we are on Instagram as well, at behold_retreats. We're not as active on social media as we might like to be. We have plenty of clients and guests finding us in other ways, and I prefer to do more things like this, to be honest, to connect with people like yourself and your audience. Is just more fun to have a more in-depth conversation and try to be of service.
Hi friends, Jade here. I wanted to pop in because this episode is pretty long and I know it can be a bit overwhelming to consume so much information in one sitting. So I encourage you to take all the time you need to listen to this episode. And take this moment with me to take 3 deep breaths before we continue with the show. First, let's exhale and release all of the breath that we currently have. And let's begin. Breathe in. And breathe out. Breathe in. And breathe out. Breathe in. And breathe out. All right, let's get back into the show. Our second guest is Julia Blum. Julia describes herself as an empath, psychonaut, and mental health advocate. After struggling for years with various mental health challenges, she discovered and began her journey with using psychedelics for healing. She now uses her platforms to make information about psychedelics more accessible and to debunk the many common misconceptions that exist about psychedelic healing. Welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, I'm really excited about this conversation. And so before we get into it, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Julia. I work in the psychedelic space on various fronts. I'm a creator on TikTok and I write a publication called The Journey. And then I also work with organizations, nonprofits, companies, etc. in the space and help them with their strategies around scaling psychedelic medicines.
Great. So to get started, I kind of want to have people get to know you and your mental health journey. So, can you give us some background on your mental health, like what your diagnoses are, and kind of the journey that got you to exploring plant medicine?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And as you asked that question, what my diagnoses are, I realized that the phrasing for me would be were, because I don't have any of them anymore, thanks to psychedelic medicine, which for the longest time I didn't know was possible. But essentially, I think my story is probably one that people have heard before. I had the perfect life on the outside. I was living in New York. I had a great job. I had a great community, friends, everything, should have been fine. I should have been the happiest. And that was not the case. I'd been struggling with my mental health secretly for various years. I was living some type of a double life because I didn't speak too much about it due to the stigma. And the specific issues that I struggled with were a decade-long eating disorder, most prominently bulimia, but there were also some other eating disorders towards the beginning and towards the end. And then I also had major depressive disorder. I had PMDD, premenstrual dysmorphic disorder, which is kind of like PMS on steroids, but really truly more severe. That also brought out primarily depression symptoms. And then I had PTSD, both the classical PTSD and complex PTSD, so developmental trauma. So this is a whole bunch of different diagnoses. I think most of which, I was told I was going to have to learn to live with. And thankfully, I was very stubborn. And I believe that if I found the right tools that would allow me to illuminate the root causes of my problems, that I could overcome them for good, which is what eventually happened. But it was definitely not an easy path. And it took a lot longer than I hoped it would. But yeah, I'm very happy to say that like all of these issues are not present in my life anymore, which doesn't mean that my life is always perfect and easy, right? But I'm not in those places of darkness that have accompanied me for the first, 2 decades of my life, essentially.
Wow, so that's a lot to have to live with every day. And I'm wondering, like, if you went through, the traditional modalities of healing first before exploring plant medicine and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, I mean, I did. I was in therapy for years. I think I cycled through 4 different therapists over the years. I also saw different psychiatrists. I also saw 3 or maybe even 4 different eating disorder coaches for the recovery of my eating disorder. And all of that, like some of it helped more than others, but essentially it would help me sometimes, feel better, but it would never eliminate the root cause of my problem. And then, one of the psychiatrists that I saw had urged me to go on antidepressants, right? Because I was very, suicidal at that point in my life. And for me, medication was always the last resort. And I always told myself, well, I'm going to try other things first. And if then it doesn't work, I'll go and try medication. And that's not to hate on medication. I think there's definitely a place for it as a short term intervention. But the way it's used right now with most people is that it's a long term treatment where we put people on medication for the rest of their lives. And that not only often works poorly, but also prevents you from illuminating the root cause, because by taking medication, you manage the symptoms, but by managing the symptoms, you also mute them. So you lose the chance to dialogue with your psyche that is clearly trying to tell you something, right? So thankfully, I discovered psychedelic medicine before I went to the medication. I think I would be in a very different place right now if that had unfolded differently.
Yeah, and I will just say that I am in the space of having been medicated for years now, and like over the past 2 years, like getting into psychedelics and realizing the healing nature of them. And that's why I want to reiterate again why I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, because I definitely feel like it's a topic that some people think we shouldn't even be talking about. So I guess my first question around this is what prompted you to get into exploring psychedelics and plant medicine, and what was the first psychedelic that you used?
hmm So I had a little break in my career where I went to business school, which was really fun and left me finally with some spare time after working like really long hours for years. And I read a lot during that time. And one of the books that I randomly read was How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, which I think now in hindsight is probably every second person you ask has come to the topic through that book, right? If not even more. And I read that and I became immediately so fascinated because at that point I'd already been on a spiritual journey for quite some time. I've been a meditator for years, so I'd always been interested in consciousness, and I'd started practicing yoga and diving more into Buddhist philosophy the year prior. So I found psychedelics to be really like mentally stimulating, the idea of them at least, right? And then I was very risk averse. So I didn't touch anything until I felt that I was ready. And for an entire year, I just educated myself on the topic. And then when I did feel ready, the very first experience that I had was LSD in a somewhat recreational setting. I was with a small group of friends on vacation in nature, and we had rented a house, and everyone, you know, took the LSD. And for everyone, it was the first time, and everyone had a beautiful day, and it was really, really a lovely experience. And it wasn't my first psychedelic experience, wasn't the most healing psychedelic experience, but it was enough to prove to me that the potential that I hoped they would have, I could see and how I connected with that medicine on that specific day. And yeah, that was the first one. And then a few mushroom encounters followed. And then pretty quickly I discovered ayahuasca, which was probably the most important plant in my own healing journey.
Can you talk about your ayahuasca experience?
Yeah, sure. You're gonna have to cut me off because there's a lot to tell.
Okay, no, I'm
But
open for all of it.
essentially, ayahuasca as a medicine, I think that a lot of people misunderstand as the most dangerous. Like, none of these substances are dangerous, but often in people's eyes, ayahuasca is like, oh, wow, you're drinking that, right? They put it in a different category than mushrooms, etc. Now that I've, sat quite a bit with that medicine, I can really, with full confidence, say that it's like the safest medicine there is. And it can be an intense experience, but the rewards you get are unparalleled in my mind. I haven't tried all psychedelics, but I've tried a lot of them. And for me, ayahuasca will always hold a special place in my heart because of the, experiences that it has gifted me. And I woke up one day and I was quite intimidated because everyone, speaks about all the things surrounding ayahuasca that are intriguing, the purging, etc., and the visions. And I was quite scared. So I knew like I was going to do it at some point in my life, but I didn't feel the urgency to until I woke up one day and I knew I was ready. And 3 weeks later, I was at a retreat in Costa Rica. Like I literally just booked that day and I was there and all the fears and worries were just wiped. Like I arrived there and I felt so ready and I had full confidence that that was, where I needed to be. And I did a week-long retreat that had 4 ceremonies embedded in that week. And I think that's where my healing journey really began. After that first retreat, I came back. I didn't connect again with the medicine for an entire year because it took me so long to integrate what I'd learned about myself in that 1 week. And then later, once I had already made a few changes in my life, I returned to the medicine. And I think that was like the second stage of my healing. And because after the first time, I think I bought a little bit into this like miracle cure language of like, okay, like ayahuasca is the last resort. I'm going to do that. And that's hopefully going to like fix everything. And it didn't. Like it changed so much for me. But I came back and 2 months later, I relapsed in my eating disorder and some other things came back. And I initially thought, oh God, I've failed ayahuasca. If even ayahuasca can't save me, I'm a lost cause. But turned out I just needed more time and patience and more work. And so that was like stage 2, where I returned to the medicine for like a pretty intense period of a year where I went to quite a few ceremonies and did a lot of really deep work in between the ceremonies to prepare and integrate. And then, after that fifth retreat, all my mental health symptoms were gone. And I haven't returned since. I know I will at some point, but it was pretty, it was pretty efficient.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that that's what a lot of people wish for. You talked a little bit about integration, and I think that that's something that I know is talked about a lot in the psychedelic space, but outside of it, people are probably like, what does that mean? So, can you talk a little bit about what the integration part of a psychedelic experience is and what that looks like specifically for you?
Yeah, totally. So, what happens during a psychedelic journey is that you experience a change of awareness. Like something will be brought into your awareness that previously wasn't. Or maybe it was, you were semi consciously aware, but you didn't realize the impact that like certain things had on you. And psychedelics change that. And in addition to that, they give you teachings, right? About yourself, about the world. And then you come out of ceremony and it's up to you then what you do with that, right? Because the psychedelic won't heal you, but the psychedelic can show you the path that you have to walk to heal yourself. But you're still going to have to walk it. And that's what happens after ceremony. And that's arguably way more difficult than any of the work that you do in ceremonies or in journeys, right? So it's the practice of how do I show up every day in my life and embody these new awarenesses and these new teachings in a way that sustainably will, alter how I operate in this world. And that was very tricky for me because, especially with an eating disorder of such addictive nature, I was bulimic, right? Food I had to confront every single day. It's not like I don't want to compare, but if you have a substance addiction, there's a clearer cut, right? You cut out the substance and then you're done. With food, you have to develop a relationship with it. So the biggest part of my integration was that and learning emotional coping skills, which I didn't have as a result of the eating disorder and some of the other things, right? So the medicines gave me heightened emotional awareness, but it didn't necessarily give me tools to cope with these newly found emotions, right? I still had to figure that out myself. So finally, I could feel way more than I ever had felt. And just to give you an example, like I was, I've lived alone all my life. I've traveled a lot. I've always been alone a lot. And I, as an introvert, I've always appreciated it. But it was only after my first ceremonies that I felt loneliness for the first time in my life at age 27, which like I just didn't know the emotion, right? And then what do I do when I feel loneliness? I don't know, right? Like there are so many default coping mechanisms that then the work becomes to not fall back into those. And that's where integration support is really, really critical. And I think it depends on the case always, but I definitely could not have done my integration on my own. I needed more support. And for me, that looked like different things at different times, right? It was therapy, it was more specialized psychedelic integration coaching. I did some somatic practices. I did a lot of embodiment work myself, meditation retreats, like the full spectrum. There's so much that you can do, and it's highly individual for everyone based on, what the wounds are that you're healing. But you want to make sure that when you return to real life, you return into a setup that is really supportive of the new version that you're becoming. Otherwise, there are always so many parts in our brain that are just going to fall back into old thinking and habit patterns because that's always going to be easier. And psychedelics doesn't extinguish the ego, right? It's still there and it's still going to do its thing after ceremony. And it's up to us to develop a new relationship with those parts of us that are difficult.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm glad that you mentioned it's individual because I think even I, in my integration, have an idea that it looks a certain way and then I get really down on myself for it not looking that certain way, and I feel like it takes away from the experience. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that it's very individualistic. I want to talk more about, I guess, the maintenance of your mental health with things like medications. It's like you take them every day, and that's what's supposed to maintain your symptoms. But for you, using like psychedelics and plant medicine for healing, how are you maintaining and staying well, even though you're not having these experiences consistently like a
Mhm.
medication, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that question. And it's also evolved over time. If you'd asked me that question a year ago when things were still fresher, I would have had probably a more nuanced answer. Like there were a lot of things that I was doing as I went through this process and came out of it to maintain my stability that I had gained. And I was quite, religious about like certain routines that I had. Like writing has always been one of my biggest tools for integration. That's why I started writing, eventually publicly, but also more privately. Journaling is, I think, the most underrated integration practice. And I did like morning pages where you just stream of consciousness write every single morning a few pages for so many, months, maybe even years. Meditation, yoga, several embodiment practices, community practices where, for example, this one thing that really, really helped me coming out of it was an authentic relating practice called circling, where once a week I would be in community with other people on healing journeys and we would have a very authentic exchange. And, authentic relating is like an interpersonal meditation where you meditate on what it's like being you in presence of the other people, right? And I did a lot of things. So I feel like my days were really filled with like things I'm doing for myself for quite a long time. And that only shifted over the last few months as I got more and more busy with work and I had less, time for all of these elaborate practices. But I also realized there was less need. And that was kind of beautiful because, my mental health had always been the number one priority for the last, throughout all of my 20s. It was the number one worry at all times, every single day, right? And now I forget about it. And meaning I forget about it is that, I I don't rely on as much routine things as I do anymore to maintain what I have. Now, I want to caveat that by saying that my lifestyle has changed a lot in the process, right? So I think I'm maybe not doing like certain ritualistic things as much, but I think the way that I show up in the world has changed so much that that alone gives me a lot of, energy for my mental well-being. And I think, above all, my biggest tool for maintenance is my commitment to presence. And that shows up in different ways. The number one way is probably that I stopped drinking alcohol, right? Which has had a huge positive benefit on various areas of my life, right? And I'm spending my time quite differently, right? I socialize differently. I spend way more time in nature and one-on-ones versus like bigger groups, like things that would used to drain me a lot. They're not as present in my life anymore because I've really created a life that feels more aligned with who I am and how I, expand my energy. So life feels easier right now, but not because it's become easier, but because I've made the changes that make it easier to live as me, right? I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah, it's a good question for sure. And I'm sure things will come up in the future where I'm going to go through phases where I will rely on more deliberate tools. And like right now, really all I do is like my daily meditation and a few times a week my yoga practice and daily walks and writing. Like these are the core pillars I would say to my mental health. Like it's much less elaborate than it used to be, but like it makes me happy to reflect on the fact that I can do these things and it can be enough. I don't need to make my mental health a full-time project anymore, right? It's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Like, I just personally myself, and I just know people who are in that period of our job is working on our mental health right now. And so, yeah, hearing you say that just honestly gives me so much hope. I want to go back into psychedelics and talk a little bit about recreational versus like medicinal, or using them for healing purposes. Because I've also seen you post a little bit about this on your TikTok. And I just want to ask you about, like, how has that been to start to explore psychedelics for recreational use as well?
Yeah, it's a very new topic. Other than, that inaugural LSD trip, which was recreational in its essence, it's always been healing for me exclusively. And I was quite religious about it. And I really did not feel compelled to use them socially because I held them on such a high pedestal, which I still do, aside from how I use them. But for me, it was a matter of like paying respects, right? And do I do the mushrooms justice by just taking them on a random day at a random festival or whatnot, right? I have such deep awe and reverence for these medicines that I wanted to have encounters with them that would show that and honor that. And that was like my prevailing, mindset for many years. And now that, my mental health has really evolved to a place where I don't need to do them to heal, because I'm sure I'm not like, no one's ever fully healed. I always have like little topics, but I don't have mental health symptoms that make my life hard anymore, right? So that means that for me, it put me into this new stage of exploring psychedelics from a more recreational lens. And I've really learned throughout that process that psychedelics are not just for healing. They're, I wanting to heal is the most beautiful intention for them, but there are other intentions that are equally valid, I think. And some of them are, to experience joy, awe, wonder, to have fun, right? It can be simple things, to connect with your friend, your partner, or a group that you're doing it with, right? And obviously, those are different medicine experiences because the dose will be different and quite lower, right? Because like the traditional psychedelic journey that I think of is best done alone or in like a traditional group ceremony setting, because it's you and the medicine and the two of you have a dialogue, and there's not really space for a lot of other people to intervene other than the people who are holding the space for you to have that experience, right? But recreational use for me is beautiful because if you take smaller amounts, it can put you into those. And I almost don't like using this language because it's so new agey, but these vibrational frequencies of openness and love and expansiveness and connectedness together with other people or even alone. And you get to experience the world just a little bit different, right? And sometimes that's all we need as a reminder of the beauty of nature, of ourselves, of our connections, is to just, wipe our glasses clean. And I feel like that's what recreational use has given me. And I really have these like beautiful days with people I hold dearly. And I'm just reminded how beautiful life is and that the universe really does take care of us. And, I don't know why I judged it so much. It's honestly, I mean, not every psychedelic is meant to use recreationally, right? You cannot have a recreational ayahuasca ceremony that not with that medicine that doesn't work with. There are others like LSD mushrooms where it works pretty well, right? And I think it's really, given me a lot, especially because I don't drink. And then I contrast that experience to an experience where someone else would drink in the same setting. And I just feel like it's so much more rewarding to have like a mini psychedelic trip than to drink. And I don't see why I would ever do the, drinking again, but I can totally see psychedelics being a part of my life in that form for the, foreseeable future. maybe not forever, probably not forever, and you shouldn't overdo it. You should still need to make sure you maintain that reverence of the substances, right? But I think you're not doing any harm by exploring these more recreational uses.
Yeah, and you mentioned judging a little bit, and I want to get into some misconceptions about psychedelics because we know that there's still a lot of taboo around the topic. So, can you talk about some of the most common misconceptions you come across when it comes to psychedelics?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's like half of my TikTok life. It's just, making things right in people's minds. And that's the reason that I started it, right? It was to educate. And I think the more that I'm confronted with these misconceptions, the more I'm validated in the work that I'm doing because I recognize how important it is, right? I think that the number one or one of the number ones is this is just glamorized drug use, right? And I think what's underneath that is the assumption that all drugs are created equal and that all drugs are bad. And what people forget is that medicine and medications are drugs too, right? We just don't often call them that way. We call it medication, right? But I think we really have to untether ourselves from this federal drug schedule that regulates the legality of substances, where in the Schedule 1, we are including all of the different substances that policymakers, you know, criminalized decades and decades and decades ago based on, political motivations and not based on safety, medicinal benefits, etc., right? So I think the number one thing that I try to educate people on is the nuance between different substances, right? I think another big misconception is that psychedelics are dangerous, and that most often comes through in people fearing the bad trip. And I think the bad trip is the biggest misconception probably of them all. I don't think bad trips exist, and that's probably the statement that I get the most pushback from for on TikTok, because people will tell me that's not true. You just never had a bad trip. Like I had a bad trip. XYZ. And I think like what I really would love for people to understand is the reframe from like bad trip to heart trip. Like I'm not saying that psychedelics cannot produce challenging experiences. They certainly do. And I think it's more relevant to understand that challenging experiences happen for a reason and you can find meaning in them. And when you have the support and tools to navigate them, then you will find that actually those are the experiences that can provide the most, therapeutic benefit. But there need to be certain, things in place in order to get that. So if you're at a festival and you're taking a bunch of mushrooms and some trauma comes up that you didn't know was there and you're acting out and you don't want to think about it, so you're resisting it, psychedelics are very stubborn. They're going to make it louder and louder until it's like unbearable and then you freak out. Then that's a question of setting, right? If you had the same experience in a one-on-one setting with a psychedelic mushroom guide, and this memory would come back and you would have someone to talk through the experience, you would be able to navigate it very differently. And it starts even before the setting. It starts by having the awareness that whatever comes up is in service of your own well-being, whether that's something beautiful or something difficult, right? And I think that's something that people often forget. And I always have to caveat, because there are some people where there is a risk for more permanent damage from psychedelics, but that's a very small minority. That's people that have schizophrenia in themselves or in their family, or any type of psychosis in a first-degree family member or themselves, right? But for most people, this idea that you take this psychedelic and it's going to make you permanently crazy, like the risk is so minuscule, and there's research and research and research, yet people still believe that. People still believe this, bullshit propaganda from the 80s, 70s, 80s, and the war on drug, essentially, that, LSD is going to fry your brain and whatnot. And I mean, these were political campaigns that had millions of dollars behind them to scare the public, and clearly they worked. And no one right now is campaigning for the opposite. No one's running around. I mean, there are some advocacy groups, but like, who's educating the public on psychedelics? No one really, right? The researchers don't have time to do that. Companies don't really have the incentive to, and do it very selectively. And policymakers certainly aren't educated themselves to do that and don't have any incentives to. So I think that's another big one is, the bad trip and the danger of these substances. And maybe the last one that I'll mention, because I think that's also a super important one, is this notion that psychedelics are miracle cures. And I think that's very prominently used by a lot of, the psychedelic retreats or clinics that are popping up. I see it on my own, social media all the time. Like, I received my miracle. I had 10 years of therapy and one night. And, I would talk about my own experiences in that way, but you have to be careful how it's received by people, because some people will read this and believe, oh, that's the magic pill that I've been waiting for that's going to solve all my problems. And that's dangerous, because if you don't manage expectations accurately, it can make you more miserable. Like, after my first retreat, and I went to one of those retreats where they literally have like a number on their website, 97% of visitors say that they received their miracle in their week here, right? So I was expecting my miracle, right? And I did receive what I perceived to be a miracle, but I left and I returned home and I relapsed shortly after in my eating disorder. And I thought that I had failed the medicine and that I was even too broken for ayahuasca, right? And that, made me really unwell. And I think if I had known before that that's just the natural progression of the healing path, that, sometimes it's not one retreat and done, that it requires more work. That's, where integration comes in again. Then I think it would have been like maybe as much of a smoother, ride. But I really want people to understand that these modalities have immense, immense potential, more potential than anything else that I know in the mental health space, but they're not cure-alls, right? And we have to figure out how to integrate them into our lives, into our, psychiatric care in a way that leverages that potential while also providing enough support structure so that we can really make use of it, right? And not let it go to waste.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because it is like, once the psychedelic is in the picture, it's like you have to bring the work. And I agree that even in my experience, I was expecting to feel more healed after my psychedelic experiences. And I think even that experience of like the disappointment and having to sit with the disappointment and realize what that medicine is really for was healing in and of itself, for me at least.
Yeah, totally. And I think our minds are primed that way because we're grown up in this Western mentality to health where you have an issue and then you get the quick fix. Like, you have depression, this is the medication you take every day, and within a few weeks, your depression will be gone, right? Or even more extreme in other areas of healthcare. And these modalities work very differently, right? These wisdom traditions, they're not quick fixes. They are the opposite of a quick fix. They are opening up the deepest core wounds that are within you, that all parts of your personality fiercely protect so you don't get too close to them. And then you crawl your way out of it. And that crawling can take months, years, sometimes. Like, for me, it certainly took years, right? But if you keep doing the work and keep showing up in that way, and you're committed to that journey, you're going to reap the rewards essentially. And the rewards are going to completely outweigh anything else that you've had before, because what I think psychedelic healing really can gift you that a lot of other mental health care treatments can't is freedom. Like, most mental health care treatments don't make us free. They numb us, or they capture us more in our illnesses and they mute it. But psychedelic healing can help people find freedom again from the ailments that, have burdened them. And I think that's worth the tough climb, right?
For sure, for sure. I want to talk a little bit about your TikTok and kind of just what prompted you to share your experiences on social media and like what made you choose TikTok specifically.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think I started sharing through my writing. I started on a blogging platform called Medium. Now it's 2, maybe even 3 years ago. And I use it as a way to, publicly practice my writing. And then later, I remember I wrote one article about ayahuasca and it went viral. And I realized, oh, people really want to know about this. And I continued writing about ayahuasca, and it really helped me process my ceremonies through writing. And it really helped me with the meaning making. And then, earlier this year, I realized that I wanted to make more resources accessible to people for psychedelic education because, as I mentioned, I saw really a gap in how we educate ourselves about these modalities in an unbiased way that is both scientific and spiritual, right? And it's not overly clinical, it's not overly woo-woo. It takes both into account, and I didn't really see a lot of that. And I decided I was going to start this weekly newsletter, and I did all that. And then I read somewhere that TikTok now has more traffic than Google. So I realized, okay, if you want people to see your work, then you got to be on TikTok. And that's when I like committed to TikTok. And I know for a few days, I just became very obsessed with like how the algorithm works. And I really read about everything and watched a bunch of videos. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to go all in. I'm going to give it 30 days and not expect anything before, but do it at least 30 days. And I was like very consistent. And, in the first 30 days, I already had millions of views, and it really confirmed to me the potential of the platform and the relevance of my message that I wanted to carry out into the world. But, underneath all of this is just this craving that I have for more people to know about this. I think there's quite a few people, or an increasing amount of people that know about it, right? But I still think of it as the psychedelic bubble because we're still such a minority, right? And I want the random mom of 4 who struggles with depression all her life and lives like in a small town in the middle of the country, who doesn't have access to like psychedelics or clinics or anything, or even retreats abroad or like spiritual communities. I want her to see about it on TikTok because I want her to start questioning how she's been telling her story to herself based on what doctors, etc., tell her. Because that's the problem. A lot of people get their education from their doctors. And I'm not saying doctors are wrong. Obviously, they have like decades of education and experience to validate their practices, but they're trained in a very specific way to view mental health. And for some people that works, but, quite frankly, for most people, it doesn't. Like with depression specifically, we can see how small the shares of people that respond well to the current treatments that we have, right? And then I think about that woman that sits there and she thinks her brain chemistry is just flawed and it's always going to be that way, and that she's always going to be depressed, and that the only thing she can do is, endure and take these medicines every day, these medications. And that just like breaks my heart because I want people to have access to those information so that they can inform themselves and make choices. I'm not saying everyone should do psychedelic healing, for sure. It's not for everyone. Not everyone needs to do it. But I want everyone to at least have the choice to decide how they view and tackle their mental health. And I feel like that's being taken away in the current system for most people.
That is so beautiful. And honestly, like part of my mission as well, just to make all of this stuff, all of this information more accessible. Like even going to college, like I went to school and studied psychology, and even the barriers there, like all the things that I learned in school, all of the articles that I got access to because I was affiliated with the school that people who aren't affiliated with the school don't have access to is ridiculous. And yeah, I just absolutely love that you're making this information accessible, both in like access and in like understanding it too, because I feel like you speak in a way that a lot of people can understand, and that's really helpful as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this I feel like that was a great way to wrap this conversation up. I have one more question. This is like my signature question for this season because I really want to emphasize to my audience the importance of self-care this season. So, what is one thing that you do to maintain mental wellness?
I think it's what I alluded to earlier,
Yeah.
is commitment to presence, and maybe to be more clear about what that means in my day to day is learning to hold the full range of my emotional experience every day. And that continues to be a learning process, right? Like, I don't think I'm ever going to be done learning to do that, but accepting anything that comes up for what it is and learning to hold that part of me that is showing, difficult emotions or whatever it may be, learning to hold that with kindness and compassion, and learning to hold the polarities that come with that. Like, there is a part of me that feels unworthy right now, and there is a part of me that knows I'm always worthy. And both can exist at the same time. I think that's what I just remind myself every single day.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think this is going to be a really amazing conversation for people to hear. It's going to be tied in with another conversation with another psychedelic expert. So thank you so much for coming on here and being so open and honest and vulnerable. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I love that the work that you're doing. It's so, so important. So thank you also on my end on being out there and educating people.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Students of Mind. I want to give a special thank you to my guests, Jonathan and Julia, for being on the show today. They were both really rich conversations, and I'm so excited to share them with you all. To follow or get in touch with today's guests, all of their info will be in the description of this episode. If you have a moment, please leave a rating and review for the podcast. This helps me know if you are enjoying the episodes and gets each episode into more ears. Don't forget to join our community, Students of Mind Chats, on Facebook. If you want to see more from the Students of Mind team, all of our links are in the description of the episode as well. Thank you again for listening. I hope you learned something new or resonated with something you heard today, and I will see you next episode.